Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. Now we're going to be starting a new series here on the channel, so I hope you all enjoy it. We're just going to do it, I think, from weekend after Thanksgiving up to Christmas. So without further ado, let's get to it. I bet you guys have already figured out the theme of today's video. We're going to do a video on narrow gauge locomotives in the Nevada area, right? So we're going to talk about the Eureka, the Glennbrook, and the Tahoe. Now let's start with the Eureka. The Eureka was originally purchased by the Eureka and Palisade. It was purchased as their number one in 1875. It's a cousin locomotive to the Glennbrook, and the Tahoe is kind of the sister to the Glennbrook because it was built in 1876. So it's a year younger than the Eureka and the Glennbrook. But their builder's plates are actually, the serial number on the builder's plates are very close. So they probably even saw each other in the same shops. Anyway, so the Eureka was built for the Eureka and Palisade Railroad as their number one. They actually bought two 440s, and the other one was named the Palisade. What a good idea. We're the Eureka Palisade. We buy two steam engines. One's going to be the Eureka, the other one's going to be the Palisade. How creative. Anyway, so they purchased the Eureka, and, well, eventually the railroad would close. So they sold the Eureka to another railroad. This railroad would be called the Utah Northern, which was another narrow gauge railroad that was probably looking for some used secondhand equipment, something lightweight like the Eureka, and that's where you would get the number 4, which is kind of interesting because the Eureka and Palisade bought the engine as their number 1, sold it to the Utah Northern, and the Utah Northern numbered it the 4, but kept the name Eureka, I think. Don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. This video, if you haven't noticed, is not going to give specific dates, it's just going to tell a general story of these locomotives. Anyway, the Utah Northern used it until it would eventually be sold to Hollywood, where it would be used in many different movies that I cannot remember a single name for. So that's the story of Eureka and Palisade number 4. But now let's talk about the Glennbrook and the Tahoe. Well, the Glennbrook was purchased by the Carson, Tahoe, Lumber, and Fluming Company. Glennbrook was the number 1, and the Tahoe was the number 2, also went by number 3 and later on number 5 after it was sold to the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad, another gold mining railroad. That was a pretty typical thing in Nevada. If it was a narrow gauge railroad, or really any railroad in the 1800s, late 1800s, they probably were hauling gold on this line. Anyway, the Glennbrook and the Tahoe were used on the Carson, Tahoe, Lumber, and Fluming Company. It's quite a name, isn't it? And they were used to haul lumber along with passengers. They also had a boat called the Lake Tahoe. Don't quote me on that. I think it's the Lake Tahoe. But the boat sailed in Lake Tahoe, and either the railroad or the boat connected up with the Central Pacific, and they were running passengers back and forth across the lake. And I believe it eventually sank. Anyway, the two engines would be used there until a man named Samuel Clemens showed up. Now, Samuel Clemens came to Virginia City to be a gold miner. He simply was there to mine for gold. But then he and his friends decided that, well, there's not a lot of money in gold mining. We think logging is where all the money's at. So they went into the logging business together. They staked out a huge plot of land that they were going to start their logging company up on. By the way, this plot of land was in Lake Tahoe. But what ended up happening? Well, they never actually did any logging on this land that they purchased. Instead, they basically just hung out on it. They rode around in canoes, and they, hung out around campfires and drank whiskey. Well, whiskey and fire equals out of control fire, which then equaled all their land burning down, including the Carson, Tahoe, Lumber, and Fluming Company, which would then basically mark the end of the Carson, Tahoe, Lumber, and Fluming Company. But who is this man named Samuel Clemens? Well, he actually is Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens would go on to change his name to Mark Twain, his stage name of sorts for writing. And he would obviously write the books, everyone knows, such as Huckleberry Finn. He also wrote a book named Roughing It. That book tells the story of how he burned down the woods and, riding around in canoes and having a good old time until the forest burnt to the ground. Obviously, that kind of chased them out of the area because the logging companies hated Mark Twain and his friends because, well, it was business, and now their business is nothing but a bunch of ashes. So, yeah, that's the gist of that story. Anyway, the Tahoe and the Glennbrook would be sold to the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad, which is now, a lot of their equipment is the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad Museum. We'll get to that in a minute as well. Anyway, so the two locomotives were sold to the Nevada County Narrow Gauge, which is a gold mining railroad. And, they were quite successful because gold mining, big business, right? Anyway, eventually the gold mining started to decline, and they were running less and less trains, and they needed less motive power. So the railroad decided to thin out its fleet, and the Tahoe and the Glennbrook were some of the smaller locomotives. So they sold them to the movie business, Hollywood. And as it turned out, that rail historian Gerald M. Best, who also worked for Hollywood, his big job was to go around and find old steam locomotives that could be used for movies, particularly westerns, because that was a big thing around this time. And Gerald M. Best, his job was to go find little steam engines that were easy to transport and could easily be decorated to look like that Victorian-era steam locomotive that you all know well in westerns. So Gerald M. Best picks up all these engines, including the Eureka. That's kind of where the Eureka comes into play, and where the three engines kind of reunite. Anyway, these locomotives all go off to the movie business. Why did Hollywood like these engines? Well, they're small, narrow gauge engines, easy to load up on a tractor trailer and take anywhere you need to make a movie. Much easier than like the Virginia and Truckee locomotives, or to create a sense of depth, because we do it a lot in the model railroad world where we use big buildings up front, little buildings in the back. They kind of do that with the narrow gauge railroads for the movies. Or if they didn't have the space to have one of the big Virginia and Truckee 440s, which this is where the Virginia and Truckee comes in, because Gerald M. Best was also saving a lot of the V&T's equipment and selling it to Hollywood to be used in movies. Anyway, the Tahoe would be used in a lot of John Wayne movies. And, everyone's seen the John Wayne movies, right? Anyway, so the Tahoe and I think it was the Genoa, the V&T's Genoa, were used in a lot of John Wayne movies. The Genoa was used for a lot more of the open field scenes where the train was running through open spaces, and the Tahoe would be used for close-up scenes where they were either like on the train or really close up to the train, because it had to fit in a set or a very small area. It had to fit in the shot, where the Genoa didn't really provide that. So they used the smaller Tahoe in smaller scenes like that. It was also a much easier locomotive to just pull out and get what you needed to film and then call it a day. So that's what those locomotives would be used for, and you could easily decorate them up. Tahoe, I believe, was also used in some of the, let me think, Twilight Zone movies. That's it. Anyway, the Tahoe was used in the last, or in Twilight Zone, the movie, and that was actually the last time I believe that it was ever on camera. Not 100% sure on this. Remember, folks, I'm not 100% sure on everything, but if memory serves me correct, this is how this story went. Again, we're just kind of telling stories. We're not really getting into historical dates and exactly when everything happened. Anyway, then you start looking at, okay, well, Hollywood's westerns are starting to be on decline, and if we need a steam train, we just use CGI. Personal opinion, I think a movie is so much better when you have actual trains. Like Harry Potter had actual trains. A lot of these old westerns had actual trains. Even though they're corny, it still made the movie so much better because you had actual things in it. Anyway, There's a thing with studio fires. A lot of these engines were in studio fires. Eureka, I know for a fact, was in a studio fire. And the Glennbrook or the Tahoe were, and possibly both. I can't remember exactly. Anyway, one of them, if not both of them, were possibly in a fire. But it was actually Eureka because it was in a fire because Hollywood didn't really need steam engines anymore. They just kind of left them. Mr. Dan Markoff came across Eureka. He privately owns Eureka now. And he restored it in, I think it was an RV shed in his backyard. Very interesting story. Again, we're not going to go into specific details of it, but that's the gist of it. So that was how Eureka was restored. And then I think it was a Tahoe that was in a fire, because I think Glennbrook sat on display for a long time before the Virginian Truckee, the Nevada State Railroad Museum, which is kind of the Virginian Truckee Railroad Museum, purchased the Glennbrook, and then it sat for a while before they finally restored it. Absolutely amazing locomotive. And then the Tahoe is the sister engine to the Glennbrook, again built a year later, and it was sitting on display in the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad, is the number 5, and they decided to restore it to its more modernized version. Again, Glennbrook was brought back to like its 1885 appearance, and then Tahoe was brought back to its most recent Nevada County narrow gauge appearance. Obviously not like what you see in this picture. This is kind of like its, I guess, late 1890s, maybe early 1900s, when they're still wood-fired. Also, interesting fact, in the preservation era, Eureka and Glennbrook double-headed, which is kind of how those two locomotives get together in modern history, and how they're now kind of the main Victorian-era steam locomotives. And believe it or not, Tahoe wears Glenbrook's boiler. Now, why is that? Well, they were both converted to burn oil, and they were restoring Tahoe to be its more recent Nevada County narrow gauge appearance, where it was, still had some of the original style, the Victorian era style, but it still had the steel cab and all that, and it was to burn oil. Anyway, Tahoe's boiler was shot, and Glennbrook was being converted back to its old appearance to burn wood. Now, why were the boilers different? Well, oil is, you get more BTUs from oil versus wood. So you need a bigger firebox, and they could get away with a smaller boiler, so they put the smaller oil-fired boilers, just slightly smaller, a little bit different boilers. So the two locomotives, they basically just said, well, Glenbrook's boiler is still good, so we'll give it to Tahoe, and then we'll just trade for some wheel sets. And then they built a new wood-fired boiler for Glennbrook. Anyway, so just kind of interesting. Tahoe wears Glenbrook's boiler. They're the same locomotive, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. I had a lot of fun doing this video. Very simple video, nothing really going on, but I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you all enjoy it. Again, I'm going to try to make one of these for every Saturday from the week after, or the weekend after Thanksgiving, all the way up till Christmas, and we're going to try to get a few mixed in if I make too many throughout the week leading up to Christmas. So, super excited. Hope you all enjoy. Anyway, without further ado, let's just wrap this video up. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Please like, subscribe, share the video with your friends and family. If you want to see a more in-detailed history of how these locomotives got preserved into even our modern history as we're kind of going along, be sure to like this video. If these videos do really well, maybe we'll even make a part 2 later on after Christmas, doing more in-depth history on these different videos. But until then, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and as always, folks, see you on the rails.